Hello, everyone. Welcome to the University of Maine Cooperative Extension's Preserving the Maine Harvest webinar. I'm Kathy Savoie, and we will also be joined today by my colleague, Kate McCarty, in the demo kitchen. We'd like to thank you for joining us for yet another Preserving the Maine Harvest webinar. These webinars are designed to correspond with what's growing in season, what's coming out of your garden, what's available at the farmers markets and farm stand. And we know that summer produce is certainly in full swing here in Maine, and we've got your answers for how to preserve these foods safely using the latest guidance from the USDA. And we would like to start by reminding you of the mission of the University of Maine Cooperative Extension, which is to help Maine people improve their lives with research-based knowledge focused on issues and needs. Our educational programs include many things such as agriculture, horticulture, including our Master Gardener program, 4-H youth development, food safety, food preservation, and nutrition. And we also want to let you know that the University of Maine is prohibited from discriminating on the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, age, disability, and reprisal or retaliation for prior civil rights activities. So let's jump ahead and start to talk about today's content. Today is one of my favorite topics. I'm not going to lie. I love to talk about canning salsa safely. Tomatoes, peppers, and onions are all in season in Maine and really are the basis for making a delicious homemade salsa. So today's class will cover how to make that homemade salsa and also how to can it and how to safely make adjustments in a way that keeps it safe for home canning, but also allows you some versatility in meeting the flavor profile that your family and friends and you will really like. So we have our Zoom set up so that we can answer your questions when you enter those into the Q&A box. We will have a scheduled time for some of these questions to be answered during our Q&A section. And if we don't happen to get to all of the questions, we will answer them via email after the class is over. So thanks again for joining us, and let's get started with, again, what I called my favorite topic for home canning, and that is salsa. So we are going to, first of all, talk about pH and salsa. So an interesting little factoid is that salsa has indeed outpaced ketchup as America's #1 condiment, and is a very popular product for home canning. I personally think it's one of the foods that you can really save a lot of money on canning at home, particularly if you are a gardener and have your own homegrown tomatoes, peppers, or onions to use. And again, it does use so many late summer vegetables. Salsa, remember, are mixtures of both low acid foods, such as those onions and peppers, and acidic foods, such as tomatoes. So it is considered a combination food when we talk about the pH scale. When combined in proper proportions, salsa is considered high acid, which means it is a product that can be preserved in a boiling water bath. So let's also recognize the importance of following a recipe that has been tested for its pH. So this does mean that it is very important to use a salsa recipe that was designed for canning and to make sure you're following the quantities, so the volume of the foods that it calls for exactly. If you're making a small batch of salsa that you're intending to serve, maybe as part of an appetizer, you can be less precise about following the recipes. But again, that's what we would consider a fresh salsa. So when you are intending to can your salsa, changing the proportion of ingredients could ultimately affect the pH, which again could potentially make it unsafe for canning and long-term storage. So we do need to pay close attention with salsa and make sure, number one, we're following a research-based recipe, and that number two, we are adhering to the proportion of those different peppers, tomatoes, and onions that are spelled out in the recipe. And again, we want to make sure to talk about making sure to follow that, measure the ingredients carefully, and to follow the research-based recipes so that we know that it is safely acidified. I did some research with a colleague of mine back in 2019. So this was myself and Jen Perry, and we were able to clearly show that concerns exist with some of your very popular online salsa recipes that include directions for home canning. Our research showed that the minority of salsa recipes published on blogs follow what we call proper USDA home canning guidance. So it is very important for you to follow recipes that have been tested to ensure that they have adequate acid for safety. Resources for today's webinar will provide a link to this actual research that was conducted, so you can do your background homework, read this research article, and then we will also include links to some of our favorite, truly my favorite, I'll be happy to share that with you, tested salsa recipes. So these are the ones that you can use and know that they are, they're going to be safe for you and your family and friends. So let's talk now about some of the, and here are where we find those research-based recipes. And again, we'll include links to those. So tomato varieties. So when we think of salsa, we typically think of tomatoes as the basis for our recipe. And let's talk about some of the basic do's and don'ts with salsa. So first up, types of tomatoes. So paste tomatoes have more flesh than what we call a slicing tomato variety. When we think of paste style tomatoes, some names that may come to mind include things like aroma style tomato. They are very oblong, and they are known for having fewer seeds and less juice and much more pulp, and they will provide a thickness for your salsa. They're also the commonly used tomato when making a spaghetti sauce. You could also use slicing tomatoes, the opposite of our paste style tomatoes. Your slicing varieties are going to have a lot more juice in them, a much bigger seed cavity, so more seeds, and less pulp. So you will run into some issues with needing to cook that salsa down to be able to achieve your desired consistency. And a surprise to a lot of people is that you can also use tomatillos for a green Salsa Verde variety. Tomatillos are known as the Mexican husk tomatoes, and they really do make for a nice flavored salsa and a very nice texture. They have a lot of seeds in them, but it just goes with a tomatillo. That's what you're going to expect. This is an important piece of information for all of us here in the Northeast, is that you can indeed substitute green tomatoes. And if you're a gardener here in Maine, you know that every year typically our frost arrives before all of our tomatoes are able to become vine ripened. So you can go ahead and gather those green tomatoes before the first frost and use those as a substitute for tomatillos. And we all know we tend to have plenty of those on hand at the end of the growing season. So let's next talk about a topic related to tomatoes, and that is the labor of love called peeling tomatoes. Oh, and I forgot to, this is a slide that shows the different varieties that you can come up with for salsas. So classic red salsa on the left. In the middle is a yellow salsa that was prepared using a yellow Roma style paste tomato. And then on the far right, you can see is a green salsa verde that was made using the tomatillos. And I oftentimes will name my different batches of food, and this was given out one year and I referred to it as the Stoplight Salsa series. So it was red, yellow, and green, and people loved the variety in that gift pack that I gave out. But next up, that labor of love I was referring to, the peeling of the tomatoes. So definitely need to deploy all of your tricks that you may know of in the kitchen for peeling tomatoes. And that includes scoring the end of the tomato, coring the tomato. And then, you know, we find that using our blanching pot with boiling water in it for a 30 to 60 second dip of those tomatoes, and then a quick transfer of those into an ice bath makes for a very effective way to peel the tomato skins. So again, quick 30 to 60 second dip in the boiling water. You can actually see the crack of the skin extend out from that scored X mark. And so that's, you know, that it's time to take them out of that blanching pot. And then the ice bath really helps cool it down quickly so you can handle them and then peel those skins right off. It's far quicker than any other method I've used. And I will again put a little plug in here for the tomatillo. You do not have to peel a tomatilla skin. You of course have to take that exterior husk off, but once you have removed the husk, which is very simple, and then wash the tomatillos, then they're ready to be used in your recipe. So beyond tomatoes, we all think of peppers as the next main part of a salsa recipe. And here's where you can actually start to think about, do I want to make a super hot salsa or do I want to make a super mild salsa? Because as for peppers, you can in fact use any kind of pepper variety as long as, so here's the rule, as long as the overall volume of peppers in the recipe is the same. So those popular pepper varieties for salsa include, and this wouldn't be my family's popular variety, a sweet bell pepper, if you like it super mild. And you can use any color bell pepper, or you can make your way up into the higher heat, higher spice level into like a habanero, a jalapeno, a cayenne, a serrano. Any of those varieties are going to give you a great level of heat. If your family doesn't like it too hot, it might be too hot. So again, you can play with the variety of peppers that you use, but you cannot exceed the volume of peppers that are called for in the recipe. So here's an example. If a recipe calls for 1 cup of sweet peppers and a 1/4 cup of jalapeno peppers, You can use any variety of fresh or canned pepper in that recipe as long as the total volume remains 1¼ cups. So in my house, my family likes a super hot salsa recipe. So I can tell you, I'm typically going to be using the majority of that 1¼ cup volume as a jalapeno pepper or even something hotter, and then very little poblano or long green chilies. But I never exceed the 1¼ cup volume. So if the peppers are chopped finely, they do not need to have the skins removed. And this is usually not an issue if they're chopped nice and fine. But if you want to, you can use different methods for blistering the skin of a pepper. And that would be in your oven, use your broiler, or your range top to apply some heat to that skin to allow it to blister, and then cool them down, and then you can remove the skin. But I can honestly say I don't do that. I just finely chop my peppers. And a reminder, remember, always wear gloves when working with hot peppers. I've made the mistake a few times of not remembering to put on gloves and, feel the heat on my hands for several hours. So remember to use those gloves when you are chopping hot peppers, and then to clean up your workstation so you don't transfer some of that hot juice to something else and then feel the heat. The other staple ingredient in a salsa would be onions. So again, we've talked about tomatoes, we've talked about peppers, and now the onions. So it is okay to use any variety of tomato. That might be red, that might be yellow. It may also be a white onion. Again, the key thing here is to not change the volume of onions in a recipe. Because again, remember our pH scale. Onions are part of that lower acid part of our pH scale. And if we alter the proportion, we throw off the acidity of the overall salsa and can run into problems when we can our salsa and store it. So make sure to measure your onions and other ingredients precisely. So the next thing we're going to talk about is acidifying our salsa. So when you are reviewing these research-based recipes that we're going to send to you, you'll see that they each have something in them that adds a level of acid to make it in the safe pH range for processing in a boiling water bath. So adding acid in the form of bottled, keyword there, bottled lemon or lime juice or vinegar is necessary when we are canning homemade salsa. And again, this is an important point because it is ensuring that our pH is low enough for processing in that boiling water bath canner. You'll see that some recipes call for bottled, and again, bottled lemon juice. And in that case, you can safely substitute bottled lime juice. Kate and I both think of lime as being more of a traditional flavor for salsas. So it is something that we prefer. Again, it's a bottled lime juice. But you can't substitute fresh lime juice when you're canning salsas. You also can't use fresh lemon juice. You must use a bottled product because it has a consistent pH. It is a standardized product, whereas a fresh lemon or lime can have a pH level that is variable based on how mature it is, how long it's been in storage for, the variety, its hydration status. All of those sorts of things can come into play with a fresh lemon or lime. So that is why the recommendations are for bottled lemon or lime juice. So let's also talk about vinegar, which again, in any home canning situation, when we mention vinegar, we are talking about one that the label clearly states 5% acidity. So you'll see that some of these research-based salsa recipes do call for the addition of vinegar. Frankly, I think of that as odd. Whenever I think of vinegar being added to fresh vegetables for home canning, it reminds me of relish. So it doesn't seem like a flavor profile that I would associate with salsa, but there are some tested recipes that do use vinegar as its acidulant. But what you need to know is that vinegar is not as acidic as our bottled lemon and lime juice. So you cannot substitute vinegar for lemon or lime juice, but you can substitute bottled lemon or lime juice for vinegar, because remember, bottled lemon and lime juice are more acidic than vinegar. So it's safe to do the substitution of bottled lemon or lime juice for vinegar, but it is not safe to substitute vinegar for bottled lemon and lime juice. Again, think about that acidity and what's happening overall to the product. So let's jump ahead and talk about thickeners. So can you safely add thickeners to your salsa? So the answer is no, unless the recipe calls for it. So there is a recipe in our resources that comes from the National Center for Home Food Preservation that does include paste tomato paste being added to it as a thickener. So that's a research-based recipe, so we know that it's safe to add that. It, however, is not safe for you on your own to think, oh, I'd really like to add, it's not thick enough, I want to add this on my own, or I want to add cornstarch or something like that. It is not recommended. If you find that your salsa recipe is too thin for your liking, you go ahead and can it as is. And then if you wanted to drain off some of that juice before you served it, you could do that. But remember to keep that you want to keep the ratio of liquids to solids as it is written in the recipe. Do not drain it before you can it. And then we always get asked the question about, oh, well, I like corn in my salsa, or I like black beans in my salsa. We do not recommend that you add the corn or beans to a recipe. Follow that research-based recipe and can it. And then when you go to serve it, then that is the time when you can add the corn or black beans or thicken it to your liking. Because remember, if you were to add other vegetables before you canned it, once again, that's an example of altering the pH of the recipe, and it could potentially make it unsafe for canning in a boiling water bath. So, last thing we're going to talk about are some herbs and spices. And it is okay to alter or leave out herbs and spices that a salsa recipe calls for. Some of the traditional salsa spices include cumin, oregano, chili powder, chipotle, if you're looking for a nice smoked flavor, salt, black pepper, cayenne, all sorts of different things. And if your family likes the flavor of one spice over another, you can substitute that. Or I will also say, like, there are some recipes that I see that have a lot of oregano in them. And, it's a little too much for my taste buds. So instead of adding the 3 tablespoons of dried oregano that it calls for, I back it off to 1 tablespoon. That's perfectly safe to do. Let's talk about cilantro. So cilantro is one of those fresh spices that I consider to be polarizing. People love it or they just hate it. So if you do like fresh cilantro, and I'm a fan of fresh cilantro, I think Kate is too, we recommend that you add that fresh cilantro just before you serve it. Because if you add it before you can it and then you cook it, you end up losing the flavor over time. So we also want to put in a plug for making sure that you use a tasting spoon and taste your salsa before you can it, so that you know that the seasonings are right. And while you still have the opportunity to adjust them, you can go ahead and do that before you can up a big batch of salsa. And I will tell you, I do have that on my to-do list today, and that is making a big batch of salsa. So we're going to go ahead and join Kate in the demo kitchen to learn how to make salsa. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can see Kate better and hear about how to make salsa. So Kate, take it away.
Great. Hi, everyone. I have just pulled the salsa to show you how to can it. So I've done some behind the scenes work that I'm going to walk you through because we have like a 30-minute cook time on this salsa. So I wanted to have it prepared to then show you the exciting part of canning it. I think the making it itself is pretty straightforward because you're just chopping and combining all of the ingredients and simmering it for the recommended amount of time. So this recipe is called tomato salsa with paste tomatoes. It's from the National Center for Home Food Preservation. We'll send you the recipe. Kathy and I really like this one. It's kind of our go-to red salsa because it uses those paste tomatoes, cooks up nice and thick, and has a lot of great flavor that you can then, of course, alter to your personal taste, like Kathy was saying, whether you're using a spicier pepper or changing the herbs and spices that you add. So I prepared a big batch. It's actually a half batch of salsa as written because I think as written, it's 28 cups of chopped tomatoes. So we did a scant 14 cups of chopped tomatoes. Still a lot. It's going to make about 8 to 9 pint jars, which is 1 canner load. So it's perfect for doing 1 full canner load of salsa and getting the most you can out of your time in the kitchen. So I selected some nice locally grown Roma tomatoes. So those are the paste tomatoes that have thicker skin that's easier to peel when you're doing that labor-intensive method of scoring them, blanching them, etc., on and on. And I saw we had a question about peeling tomatoes, which we'll definitely get to once I start filling the jars. We'll have some downtime to answer that. So we'll address why you need to peel your tomatoes. And then this is a slicer tomato, so you can just see the difference. So this is going to have more water in it, which will then, of course, result in a more watery salsa. So this one is nice and scoopable, which is if you're trying to make a homemade version, you want it to be more like one that you would buy at the store so that you're happy with all your time and energy spent to get you a high quality product. So we don't love using the slicing tomatoes for salsa, although we did say it's possible and you can just cook it for longer to get that desired consistency of a nice thick salsa. I also used, I think they were poblano peppers. So that's this pepper. It calls for a long green chili, which is more like this one. These don't really have much spice to speak of, although if you're very sensitive, the poblano would. And then I used jalapenos, a quarter cup or half a cup, a quarter cup of jalapenos. But we also have this, maybe it's a Fresno and a habanero to show the spice varieties of pepper. I like this recipe as written as far as spice level. So I make it with the poblanos and the jalapenos, and that's good for me. It's not very spicy. I think you maybe could sub out some of those poblanos for jalapenos. And then yellow onions, pretty straightforward. Garlic, a cup of lime juice. You simmer it for 10 minutes as with those ingredients, and then you add the remaining spices, oregano, cumin. We are leaving out the fresh cilantro. Like Kathy said, it doesn't really do anything if you add it ahead of time. I also added salt and pepper initially with the lime juice. So that's my salsa. I've got it simmered then for 30 minutes total, so it's nice and thick. The hot water bath canner is ready to go. It's been boiling despite the fact that it's literally on low on our gas stove. It's still boiling. But we've got our boiling water bath canner here behind the scenes. I took those, I think it's 8 pint jars, and washed them up, put them in there. We're using a wide mouth pint. Washed them up, put them up in there right side up so they fill with water. And then we covered them with water, put the canner and the jars with jars in it on the stove, and brought the whole thing to a boil. So this is preheated water, preheated jars. We've got nice hot salsa. So when we fill the jars with the hot salsa and put them back in the canner, that'll do 2 things. It'll reduce the chance that your jars would break because they've been preheated, and also will help the water come back to a boil sooner so that you can start your canning processing time sooner. So we've got preheated water in jars. That's kind of behind the scenes. I pulled out an extra rack so you could see the canning rack that's in there underneath of the jars, because that's just what you need for your boiling water bath canner. There's a big pot with a rack in the bottom. The jars are just sitting in there securely upright, full of water. I think that's all the behind the scenes stuff I want to tell you about. I got out all my canning tools. So hopefully you can either, Kathy, switch to the overhead view, or everybody can see the overhead view as well, because I'm going to be filling the jars. So I'll use my jar lifter to take 1 jar out and ladle it full of salsa. Put the jar funnel in there so we get the salsa into the jar, not all over the counter. And then I'll ladle 2 or 3 spoonfuls in here. This kind of separates as it cooks with like a juicy layer on top and then the solids. So you want to stir it and make sure every scoop is kind of the same consistency. You wouldn't want to have one be mostly solids and then be really runny. Not just from a quality perspective, but also you want to make sure each jar is the same thickness from a canning safety perspective. So you ladle your jars up until they're close to the top. We're going to leave a 1/2 inch of headspace, which is the amount of space you leave in the top of the jar to allow for the food to expand during the canning process. And I've got a little teaspoon here to help me to adjust that as needed. So this is my headspace measuring tool. It's got little steps along the bottom that help me measure that 1/2 inch of headspace for each jar. And then the other side act as a bubble freer, where you just press it in there gently to make sure you've got any trapped air bubbles out. It's not as critical with a saucy product like salsa because it fills in pretty nicely, but I like to do it all the same and then adjust the headspace as needed after you free the bubbles. And then once you're happy with your headspace and air bubbles removed, you want to wipe off the rim of your canning jar, just the very top where the lid is going to come in contact with it. Make sure you've got a good clean sealing surface. You'll apply 1 lid. These have just been washed up and set aside, so they no longer recommend heating them before canning them, but just wash them. And apply 1 screw band until it's fingertip tight. So that means just using the strength of my fingers, not my whole hand. But I want it on there firmly, but not so tight that that air that we left in there in the headspace can still get out during the canning process. That's what helps us to create that vacuum seal that we're going for. So after that, this jar can go in the canner so that it stays nice and warm while I'm filling the rest. And I will just repeat that process until all of my salsa is gone. And then once I've got the canner filled with all the salsa, if you get to the last jar, I want to add, it's important that you meet that 1/2 inch of headspace. So say I've done 7 jars and I'm filling the 8th jar, but I don't have enough for 1/2 inch of headspace. What you need to do in that instance is to just put the food in the refrigerator and enjoy it fresh, or find a smaller jar that you could can it in, maybe a 1/2 pint you could meet the headspace requirements in. But you can't can it unless you have only 1/2 inch of headspace. So that's important to maintain even on the last jar. And then our salsa's canned for 15 minutes in a boiling water bath. Once the water has returned to a boil, so put the last jar in, bring the whole thing up to a boil, apply the canner lid, And then once that water is at a full rolling boil, I'll start a 15-minute timer. Once 15 minutes have expired, my canning time is up. So I'm going to do one last 5-minute cool down. So you remove the canner lid, turn the heat off, and let your jar settle in there for an additional 5 minutes. So this will help improve the odds of sealing and give you a higher quality product. Once that 5 minutes is up, then the jars can come out. I'll put them right back on this cooling rack that I'm working on here. This helps protect your jars from the counter. If you have a counter, oops, skipped a step. If you have a counter that could cause your jars to break, like a stone countertop or metal, it's especially important. So put them on something once they've been heated up. And let your jars cool for a good 12 to 24 hours to let those vacuum seals form. I'm conscious of the time. We got about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to keep filling these jars on camera, but I want to make sure if you have any questions that we leave time to get to them before our closing wrap up. So Kathy, you got any questions?
Yeah, the only question that we have in the Q&A box is still the one about, do I have to peel my tomatoes? So we'll continue to watch you fill those jars if you want to field that question.
Yeah, so it is required to peel your tomatoes before they go in, which I do not like that step. So I'm like, I feel like it's kind of a something I'm resistant to. So I've looked into it and been like, do I really have to do this? So it's two things. It's a quality issue where the skins will, when you chop a tomato into a square, that little square piece of skin will peel off and then roll up into these unpleasant little tough sticks in your salsa. So it's a quality issue if you leave them in there. And I thought, well, if it's just a quality issue, I could live with that because I, again, hate it so much. But then I read more and read that it's also a safety concern. So these recipes are developed with peeled tomatoes in mind. And of course, the skin of the tomato is where any bacteria, molds, yeast, etc., would be, because that's the outside of the tomato. And so by removing that, you are also decreasing the potential bacterial load that ends up in the canning jar. So there I found that it is necessary for safety. So I, of course, adhere to that step. So we've also seen recommendations for using like a high quality blender, like a Vitamix or something, to puree your tomatoes. And unfortunately, with the skins on, and unfortunately, that's not recommended. I love a good shortcut, but I did find that peeling them in the oven is useful. So you can cut them in half, put them cut side down on a baking sheet and roast them in a hot oven. And the skins will come off after, I don't know what the time, how long it takes, but a few minutes, 10 minutes, you'll be able to tell.
And we've generated a couple other questions as well, Kate. So I'll just I'll put those out. So let's talk a little bit more about garlic. So in our recipes, we do use fresh garlic, and that's what's called for in the recipe. And they do tend to give you the volume in terms of cloves of garlic that are needed. So you could use your garlic press to press those down, or you could chop them up using any number of methods. But it is a fresh garlic product that is what's in the recipes. And then someone did ask, and I do want to confirm that you will be getting the recipe that Kate's making today as the follow-up resources to today's webinar. And I'd add one other trick to peeling tomatoes, and that is because you can, you take your tomatoes from the garden, you can wash them, you can core them, and you can go ahead and put them in freezer grade containers and freeze them. And then when you defrost them, those skins will slip off very easily. So that is one other method that I've used, particularly when I have leftover tomatoes from, a batch that I either harvested too many at once or bought too many. And so go ahead and freeze them. And that makes for an easy way to get the skins off as well. Someone's got a question in here about, while the jars are cooling, I put a towel over them to protect from drafts. Is this necessary? So I just want to say you're definitely thinking about the ambient temperature of the room that you're in, which is an important thing, because if you go from a boiling water bath, so 212 degrees, into a room, into an environment that has, a window open and a big, like today, we've got a beautiful breeze. That breeze is going to adjust the temperature very quickly and may cause your jars to seal too quickly. So, closing your windows, not having a fan on your jars, those are all important things. Kate also mentioned the need for that 5-minute rest time before you take your jars out of the boiling water bath and onto the cooling rack. So lots of different things. The towel over the jars is actually unnecessary. Just close your windows and eliminate any drafts that may be happening in the room. So hopefully that answers that question. And I do think we've cleared the Q&A box. So Kate, do you have any other things to add as you're going
This is
through
my last jar, so it's great
Okay.
timing. So this is going back in. It was this recipe did make 8 and some change salsa jars. It's this last jar, or the remaining salsa is not going to be enough to fill another jar. So the 8 jars, pint jars was perfect. So I've got my last jar in there. I'm gonna double check that I have at least 1 inch of water over the tops of all of these, which I definitely do. It's like almost 2 inches, so I could take some out, but I'll just, for the sake of timeliness, turn the heat up, put the lid on, and I'm gonna monitor this to wait for it to come back to a full rolling boil before I begin my 15-minute timer. And then we'll have 8 perfectly preserved jars of salsa waiting for us.
Right. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again, and we'll get the rest of the slideshow covered today. And again, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the box. We've got a few more minutes to answer those. And while we're wrapping up with the content, we will once again let you know that you'll receive a lot of these resources as attachments or links from our email that comes out. And you will be getting that research article on adherence to food blog salsa recipes. And also, new since the last time we've taught a salsa webinar, we've created a time-lapsed salsa video. And so we will include the link to that. It takes you from start to finish in 4 minutes of preparing, canning your salsa recipe. So again, if you're looking for those quick tips that show you some of those critical points in making salsa, this is a good 4-minute video for you to watch. Here are the other recommended resources that are listed as well. And then we want to whet your appetite for what's coming next. And that is on Thursday, September 21st. At 1 o'clock, we will discuss the different ways to make, to preserve meat, including pressure canning and the very popular beef jerky. And we will share an email with the upcoming registration information and those, again, the resources and recipes from today's topic on how to be, yes, all of that information. You're also going to get a link to the evaluation and a certificate of completion. And we hope that you'll take the time to complete the evaluation and provide your mailing address, because we are now going to be sending Headspace tools, but also you'll be entered into a raffle to potentially be a winner of a $20 Hannaford gift card. So I do see there's one more question in the Q&A box, and asking which resources can be considered safe canning recipes. So we encourage you to find the National Center for Home Food Preservation, which again will be included in our resource link, as well as our extension resources. And then if we do, Ball, we know, does test their recipes, and they are safe as well. So hopefully we were able to answer all your questions live, and it is 1:45 on the dot. So let's check in with Kate, see if she has any last minute advice.
I don't think so. I'm still waiting over here for the water to boil, so that's what I'll be doing for the rest of my.
Yeah. And as home canners, we all know it seems like we do wait for that pot to come to a full rolling boil. And then before we're able to start the timer. So again, thanks so much for joining us. And we hope to talk to you on September 21st to hear more about preserving meat. So thanks again.
Bye, everyone.